The Galactic Empire did not expand through chaos. It expanded through certainty. Every star system within its borders had been mapped, categorized, and assigned a status long before most civilizations even realized they were being observed. Trade routes were regulated, communication bands monitored, and military presence distributed with mathematical precision. Nothing moved without leaving a trace. Nothing existed without being known, and what was known was controlled. In the central command nexus orbiting the capital world, light panels floated in layered grids, each representing fleets, sectors, and threat indexes stretching across hundreds of light years. Officers moved between them with quiet efficiency, their voices low, their actions deliberate. There was no urgency here. There never was, because urgency implied uncertainty, and the Empire had eliminated uncertainty long ago. At the heart of the chamber, elevated above the rest, stood Admiral Varric Thal. His presence alone seemed to stabilize the room. He watched the shifting holographic map, his expression unreadable as streams of data flowed past his eyes. A junior analyst approached, hesitating only briefly before speaking. Admiral, routine sector sweep reports have been compiled. Thal did not turn. Any anomalies? A pause. No, sir. None significant. The analyst almost sounded relieved saying it. Thal finally glanced over, his gaze sharp but calm. Almost. The analyst swallowed. There is one minimized file that remains unchanged across cycles. Human space. A faint silence passed through the nearby officers. Not tension, just a subtle acknowledgement of something long settled. Thal stepped closer to the projection. With a gesture, he expanded the file. A single label appeared. Humanity status contained. Observation level minimal. Threat index negligible. No updates. No alerts. No activity flags. It had been that way for decades. Centuries, in fact. They have not advanced beyond projected technological baselines, the analyst continued, regaining composure. Their expansion has stabilized. Internal conflicts persist at low intensity. No unified military developments detected beyond their regional defense fleets. Thal studied the data in silence. Humanity, once a species that had resisted the Empire with unexpected ferocity, not the strongest, not the most numerous, but unpredictable. Their resistance had been short-lived, fragmented, and ultimately contained. Since then, they had been monitored, isolated, and, most importantly, underestimated. That had been the consensus. That had been the policy. They were granted autonomy for a reason, Thal said at last. Containment is more efficient than occupation when compliance is achieved. Yes, Admiral. And compliance is held. Yes. Thal dismissed the file with a flick of his hand. The hologram returned to its broader view of the galaxy. Orderly, segmented, predictable. Then they're not a variable, he concluded. No one questioned it, because no one needed to. The Empire did not concern itself with variables that had already been resolved. Far beyond the capital, at the outermost fringe of map space, an Imperial Patrol vessel drifted through a sector marked in quiet gray, a region designated as structurally unremarkable. No strategic value, no resources worth extracting, no civilizations of interest. A routine sweep. Routine meant safe. Safe meant predictable. Predictable meant nothing could go wrong. The ship's sensors pulsed softly as they scanned the surrounding void. Star positions were logged. Gravitational readings recorded. Background radiation levels remained consistent with expectation. The crew operated in low alert. Conversation was minimal. There was no reason for more. Then, without warning, a subtle deviation appeared in the data stream. Not an object, not a signal, a discrepancy. Commander, a sensor officer said quietly, narrowing his focus, I'm detecting a transit distortion in the lower frequency band. The commander barely looked up. Classify. Uncertain. It doesn't match known interference patterns. Natural phenomenon? Unlikely. The signature collapsed too quickly. The commander leaned forward. Slightly now. How quickly? The officer hesitated. Less than a second. The room grew still. 1 second was enough for most anomalies to be dismissed as noise. Less than a second meant something had avoided being observed. A probe was authorized. A small, automated drone detached from a vessel and drifted into the region of interest, its sensors calibrated for high-resolution detection across multiple spectrums. It transmitted continuously, feeding data back to the main ship in real time. For several seconds, everything appeared normal. Then the transmission began to degrade. Not abruptly, gradually, like a signal being interrupted. Probe telemetry dropping, the officer reported, tension creeping into his voice. Signal integrity at 60, 40, 20%. Maintain link, the commander ordered. I'm trying. The display flickered. A final burst of fragmented data flashed across the screen. Then silence. The probe's feed vanished entirely. No explosion. No debris. No emergency beacon. Just nothing. The commander stood now, fully alert. Replay the last transmission. The analyst complied. A distorted fragment of visual data appeared. Barely coherent, but enough to suggest something was there. Something massive, unregistered, and moving. The final audio fragment from the probe emerged compressed and broken. Contact, unknown, no signature. Static swallowed the rest. The commander stared at the frozen image. For the first time in that sector, routine had failed to remain routine. And in the silence that followed, one realization began to form. Quiet, unwelcome, and entirely new to Imperial doctrine. Something had just been seen. That did not want to be seen. And it had succeeded. The patrol vessel's bridge remained frozen in the aftermath of the probe's disappearance. No alarms had triggered. No explosions had registered. No debris field had formed. And yet, something had been lost. Commander Hale stood motionless at the central console, his eyes fixed on the empty feed where the probe's telemetry had once flowed. Around him, officers worked in controlled silence, their movements precise but noticeably slower than before, as if each action now required confirmation, each assumption rechecked against reality. Run diagnostics. Hale ordered. Already in progress, sir, replied the systems officer. All shipboard systems are reporting nominal. Then explained the probe. A pause followed. Not long, but long enough. The probe did not transmit a distress signal, the officer said carefully. There was no fragmentation signature, no energy spike consistent with destruction, so it was disabled or removed from the network entirely. Hale's gaze sharpened slightly. That's not an answer. No, sir. It's the only one we have. Another officer spoke up from the sensor station. Commander, I'm attempting to reconstruct the probe's final positional data. Any results? Partial. A projection flickered to life above the console. A three-dimensional representation of the sector appeared. Stars, spatial markers, and the probe's last known trajectory plotted in clean lines. At the final recorded point, the path abruptly ended, not with deviation, not with impact, with termination, as if the line had simply been cut. No scattering. The analyst continued. No drift. No residual energy signatures indicating destruction. It's as though the probe ceased to exist at that exact coordinate. Hale stepped closer to the display. Or moved somewhere we can't detect. Also possible, sir. The phrase hung in the air. Moved. Not destroyed. Not intercepted. Moved. That implied intent. That implied control. Hale exhaled slowly, then turned toward the communications officer. Transmit a standard alert to command. Mark this sector for anomaly review. Yes, Commander. A moment passed, then another. The silence on the bridge began to feel heavier. Sir, the sensor officer said again, hesitation returning. There's something else. Hale didn't respond immediately. Report. I'm detecting residual fluctuation in the same region. Residual? Yes. It wasn't present before the probe entered the area. Now it's intermittent. Define intermittent. It appears and disappears. The words drew attention. Hale turned fully now. Explain. The officer adjusted the sensor display. Filtering frequencies. The projection updated, showing a faint distortion in the void, blinking in and out of detection across irregular intervals. It's not consistent, the officer said. It doesn't maintain a stable signature. Every time we lock onto it, it vanishes before full resolution, then reappears at a slightly different coordinate. Could it be sensor lag? No, sir. The variance is too large for processing delay. Then what are we looking at? The officer hesitated again, more noticeably this time. Something that is actively avoiding observation. A quiet ripple passed through the bridge. Not fear, not yet, but recognition that something had changed. Hale studied the fluctuating distortion. Increased scan resolution. Already at maximum, sir. Cross-reference with passive and active arrays. Running. The distortion flickered again. This time, multiple sensors confirmed its presence simultaneously, yet none held it long enough to fully define it. It was there, and then it wasn't, like a shadow shifting at the edge of perception. Commander, the systems officer said, voice lower now, the fluctuation coincides with the probe's last known coordinates. Hale's eyes narrowed slightly, meaning whatever interfered with the probe is still in the area. A pause. Or something else has taken its place. No one spoke after that. The implications were subtle, but undeniable. If the distortion was related to the probe's disappearance, then the event was not random. It was connected. And if it was connected, then it was repeatable. Hale straightened. Transmit a low-frequency ping, he ordered. Sir, single pulse, non-invasive, no active targeting signatures. We observed the response. The officer complied. A brief energy pulse emitted from the vessel, expanding outward into the void, silent, invisible, but detectable to anything capable of sensing it. On the bridge displays, the pulse spread outward in a perfect sphere. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then, the distortion reacted, not by moving, not by accelerating, but by shifting its behavior. It became more unstable, more erratic, as if the pulse had been noticed. Sir, it's responding, the sensor officer said, his voice tightening. Track it. We are, but... The display flickered again. The distortion split, not physically, but perceptually, appearing in two separate locations for a brief moment before collapsing back into a single, unstable signature. That's not a natural phenomenon, the systems officer muttered. Hale didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the anomaly. Prepare a second probe, he said calmly. The bridge stilled once more. A second probe, sir? Yes. Given the loss of the first, which we now understand more clearly, Hale interrupted. A pause. Then he continued, voice steady and precise. We are not sending the probe to confirm destruction. He looked at the anomaly on the display. We are sending it to confirm intent. No one questioned the order this time, because the nature of the situation had quietly shifted. This was no longer routine, no longer a standard sweep. Something in that sector had demonstrated behavior that did not align with known physics, known tactics, or known threat classifications. And now, for the first time since entering Imperial space, The unknown had begun to respond. The second probe was launched under heightened conditions. Unlike the first, this one carried enhanced shielding, redundant communication relays, and adaptive sensor arrays designed to resist interference. It drifted into the same region with calculated precision, its trajectory plotted to the exact coordinates where the anomaly had been observed. On the bridge of the patrol vessel, tension now replaced routine. Every officer watched. Every system was actively monitored. This was no longer a passive sweep. It was an experiment. Probe is on approach, the sensor officer reported, entering target zone. Telemetry stable, another added. All systems green. Commander Hale stood behind the central console, arms folded behind his back. His expression remained controlled, but his focus was absolute. Maintain continuous recording, he said. The probe advanced. At first, nothing changed. The void remained still, empty, and visually indistinguishable from surrounding space. Stars held their positions. Background radiation levels remained consistent. No gravitational anomalies were detected, and yet the anomaly returned. Contact, the sensor officer said quietly. On the display, a faint distortion appeared again. Not fully formed, not fixed, but present. This time it's stronger, the analyst noted. Signal clarity is improved compared to the previous detection. Can we isolate it? Hale asked. Attempting. Multiple sensor layers locked onto the distortion simultaneously. The system began refining the signal, attempting to construct a coherent profile. At first, the readings were inconsistent. Then partial alignment occurred. A shape began to emerge. Not clearly, not fully, but enough. The outline suggested a structured object, angular in places, streamlined in others. A vessel, a warship, human in origin. The room fell into a subtle but noticeable silence as the reconstruction stabilized for a brief moment. Confirmed, the analyst said, artificial construct, metallic composition, mass consistent with a mid to large class vessel. Human design? Hale asked. Partially, the analyst replied after a short hesitation. Structural patterns resemble known human engineering frameworks. However, the configuration does not match any registered human fleet designs. The image flickered, then degraded. The distortion collapsed before the system could fully resolve the rest of the structure. Why did we lose it? Hale asked. Signal instability. The sensor officer replied. It's not remaining in a fixed state long enough to maintain a lock. Hale stepped closer to the display. Replay the last stable frame. The image returned, fragmented but clearer than before. For a brief instant, the silhouette of the ship appeared more defined than at any previous point. Long, segmented, but not symmetrical in the conventional sense. It seemed modular, as if composed of interconnected systems that could reconfigure themselves. Analyze propulsion signature. Hale ordered. None detected. The analyst said immediately, no conventional exhaust, no ion trail, no warp displacement consistent with known drives. Then how is it moving? Silence. Then, it may not be moving in a conventional sense, the systems officer suggested. Hale turned slightly. Explain. The positional variance could indicate intermittent spatial phase shifting. The officer continued carefully. Or a form of drive that does not produce detectable emissions within our current sensor range. In other words, Hale said, it exists outside our ability to track it continuously. Yes, sir. The distortion flickered again. This time, the probe sensors captured a fleeting anomaly, a brief interaction between the probe's transmission field and the unknown vessel's presence. For less than a fraction of a second, the probe's signal spiked, then dropped, then vanished. Probe telemetry lost. The communications officer reported immediately. No explosion. No warning. No distress signal. Just silence. Again, Hale did not speak right away. His eyes remained fixed on the display where the distortion still lingered, unstable, shifting, unresolved. Then, slowly, he said, "Recall the probe." A pause followed. "Commander, the probe is unresponsive." Another silence, this one heavier than the last. Not because the probe had been lost, but because the manner of its loss was becoming predictable. Hale's gaze sharpened. "Then we have confirmation," he said quietly. No one asked what he meant, because the conclusion was already forming in their minds. Something out there was not only present, it was selective. It allowed itself to be partially observed, but never fully defined, never fully captured. And in that behavior alone, it revealed something far more unsettling than any explosion or attack ever could. Intent. Whatever occupied that sector did not want to be understood, and it was succeeding. The response was no longer a matter of caution. It had become a matter of control. Within hours, an interception fleet arrived at the designated sector, sleek, synchronized warships forming a disciplined lattice across the void. Cruisers took position at calculated intervals. Destroyers angled their weapons in overlapping arcs, and a command vessel anchored the formation from behind. Every unit was locked into a shared tactical grid, every movement pre-planned, every outcome modeled. At the center of the formation, Commander Hale's voice transmitted across secure channels. "Target confirmed. Anomalous vessel present. Maintain formation integrity. No independent engagement without authorization." Across multiple bridges, officers acknowledged in unison. The human warship, still only partially visible, drifted within the monitored zone. Silent, unresponsive, its faint distortion signature flickered intermittently across sensor feeds, never fully stabilizing, never fully disappearing. "Range?" Hale asked. Within optimal engagement distance came the reply. "Begin communication protocols." A transmission was broadcast across standard Imperial frequencies. Clear, structured, and repeated at increasing signal strength. No response. "Attempt cross-spectrum broadcast," Hale ordered. Still nothing. The anomaly did not acknowledge, did not react, did not confirm receipt. It simply remained present. After several unsuccessful attempts, the communications officer turned slightly. "Commander," no response across all channels. Hale's expression remained unchanged. "Then we proceed." A pause. "Weapons free on my mark. Target only if necessary. We observe before escalation." On the tactical display, targeting solutions began to align. Weapon arrays adjusted. Charging sequences initiated. Fleets synchronized their firing windows down to milliseconds. Mark. The first volley was unleashed. Beams of concentrated energy lanced across the void, converging on the last known coordinates of the human vessel. Missiles followed, their trajectories optimized to compensate for evasive possibilities. For a brief moment, nothing appeared to happen. Then the anomaly reacted, not with force, with movement. The distortion shifted sharply, not in a straight evasive line, but in a pattern that disrupted multiple targeting solutions simultaneously. Several beams passed through where the ship had been a fraction of a second earlier. Missiles altered course mid-flight, recalibrating. The human vessel moved again, but this time its movement was not purely evasive. It was anticipatory. "Target lost," a sensor officer reported. "Reacquire." Attempting. Multiple sensors struggled to maintain a lock. The distortion refused to stabilize long enough for a consistent targeting solution. "Impact in 3 seconds," Weapon Control announced. The second wave of fire converged. This time, the anomaly responded differently. A portion of the incoming energy seemed to fail to converge. Beams that should have intersected at a precise point scattered slightly off course, as if their alignment had been subtly disrupted at the last possible moment. Missiles passed through an empty region where the ship was expected to be. No explosion followed, no debris field, only silence on the bridge of the command vessel. Hale's eyes narrowed. Report. Multiple misses, the weapons officer said. Target has evaded all confirmed solutions. Impossible, someone muttered under their breath. Hale did not correct them, because the data was already speaking clearly. Reassess targeting parameters, he ordered. Increase prediction depth. Compensate for nonlinear evasion. Yes, Commander. But even as new solutions were calculated, something unsettling emerged across the fleet's shared network. The human vessel was not merely avoiding attacks. It appeared to be moving in response to the patterns of the fleet itself, not reacting to individual weapons, but to the coordination behind them. On the tactical grid, its position shifted once more, and for the first time since the engagement began, several Imperial officers realized the same disturbing possibility. The enemy was not fighting their ships. It was fighting their formation. The first engagement report reached Imperial High Command within minutes. It was not labeled as a failure. Not yet, but it was marked with something far more concerning. Unclassified anomaly demonstrating adaptive evasion beyond predictive modeling thresholds. Within the command chambers of the Empire, silence carried weight. Admiral Thal stood once again before the holographic display, but this time the galaxy map had been replaced with a tactical reconstruction of the encounter. Streams of data replayed in layered sequences, weapon trajectories, fleet positioning, sensor logs, and elusive movements of the human vessel. He watched without interruption. Around him, senior officers waited for interpretation. Explain the loss of contact, Thal said finally. A tactical analyst stepped forward. The vessel did not sustain direct hits. Instead, it avoided convergence points of our firing solutions. Its movements disrupted synchronization across multiple attack vectors. Thal's eyes remained fixed on the display, meaning it responded to coordination, not contact. Yes, Admiral. A pause followed as the replay continued. Beams missing by margins too precise to be random. Missiles adjusting mid-flight. Fleet formations failing to maintain optimal alignment under pressure. Then it is not a matter of superior firepower, Thal said quietly. It is a matter of response time. No known vessel can process battlefield conditions at that rate, another officer added. Thal turned slightly. Then we are not dealing with something that follows known limitations. The room fell silent again. Recommendations? He asked. A moment passed before the lead strategist spoke. Deploy a full engagement fleet. Increase unit density. Expand cross-link communication redundancy. Saturate the engagement zone with overlapping attack patterns to eliminate evasion gaps. Thal considered the proposal. Overwhelm its ability to adapt through volume, he said. Yes, Admiral. And if it adapts faster than anticipated? The strategist hesitated. Then we escalate accordingly. Thal nodded once. Then escalation will be authorized. Orders were transmitted immediately across multiple sectors. Fleets began mobilizing. Dreadnoughts, massive, heavily armed capital ships, were diverted toward the anomaly's location. Escort formations expanded. Fighter wings were prepped for rapid deployment. This was no longer a routine interception. It was a coordinated suppression operation. Within hours, a second and significantly larger Imperial fleet entered the sector. Their arrival was not subtle. Gravitational disturbances rippled through nearby space as massive vessels translated into position, forming layer formations designed for total spatial control. On every bridge, the atmosphere had shifted. This time, there was no uncertainty in the mission parameters, only execution. Commander Hale, now reinforced with additional command authority, oversaw the deployment from the lead vessel. "Fleet formation status?" he asked. "Fully established," came a reply. "All units synchronized. Redundant communication grids active. Target reacquired. Intermittent contact. Distortion signature confirmed within engagement zone." Hale nodded. "Maintain pressure. Do not allow isolation of any unit. Keep all vessels within overlapping support range." Across the fleet, targeting systems began locking in. Unlike the previous engagement, coordination had been refined. Attack vectors were layered, timing offsets minimized, and communication latency reduced to near negligible margins. This time, the Empire would not rely on a single approach. It would apply everything at once. "Prepare full-spectrum engagement," Hale ordered. Weapon systems across dozens of ships powered to readiness. "On my mark, begin coordinated fire." The void around them seemed unchanged. Still, silent, empty. And yet, every sensor in the fleet registered the same faint, unstable presence. The human warship had not fled. It had remained, waiting, or perhaps observing. Hale's gaze narrowed slightly as he watched the distortion flicker across the tactical grid. This time, however, something felt different. Not in the fleet, not in the formation, but in the anomaly itself. As if, for the first time since detection, it was no longer just avoiding them. It was preparing to respond. The second engagement began without ceremony. No warning. No signal flare of escalation. Only the quiet, synchronized discharge of Imperial firepower across an expanding grid of space. "Fire," Commander Hale ordered. A coordinated barrage erupted from dozens of vessels simultaneously. Beams of concentrated energy cut across the void in layered streams, while missile volleys followed in carefully staggered intervals designed to overwhelm evasive patterns. This time, the Empire had accounted for variability. This time, they had introduced redundancy into every firing solution. This time, there were no single points of failure. On the tactical display, converging attack vectors formed a dense lattice around the anomaly's last known coordinates. The human warship, still represented as a flickering distortion, was momentarily enveloped in overlapping targeting zones. "Impact imminent," Weapons Control reported. For a fraction of a second, everything aligned. Then the anomaly moved, not in a simple evasive arc, not along a predictable escape vector. It shifted in a way that disrupted the timing of the entire engagement. Multiple beams intersected at points where the ship had been milliseconds earlier. Missiles adjusted, but their recalibration windows were compromised by the density of overlapping commands. Some corrected too late. Others overcorrected, veering into empty space. And yet, the human vessel did not simply evade. It adapted. Recalibration detected. The sensor officer said, urgency creeping into his voice. "Its movement pattern has changed." "Explain," Hale said. "The vessel is no longer following consistent evasive trajectories. It's altering its response patterns between engagements." "Adaptive behavior," another analyst confirmed. "It's modifying its reactions based on our attack sequences." Hale's eyes remained fixed on the display. "Is it predicting us?" A pause. "Not predicting," the analyst replied. "Learning." The distinction was subtle, but critical. On the tactical grid, the anomaly's movements began to appear less erratic and more deliberate. It no longer reacted uniformly to incoming fire. Instead, it seemed to respond differently depending on the configuration of each attack wave. Clusters of fire triggered one type of maneuver. Isolated strikes triggered another. Synchronized volleys, another still. "It's categorizing our tactics," the systems officer said quietly. Hale's expression tightened slightly, and responding accordingly. "Yes, sir." Another volley was launched. This time, The fleet introduced variation, altering timing intervals, shifting formation densities, and staggering attack patterns to avoid predictability. But even as these adjustments were implemented, the anomaly reacted again, not just to the attacks, but to the adjustments themselves. "Commander," the sensor officer said, almost in disbelief, "it's compensating for our compensations." Hale turned slightly. "What does that mean?" "It's analyzing our changes in real time. Each time we alter our approach, its responses evolve to counter the new variables." A heavy silence followed. Across the fleet, the coordinated assault continued, but the outcome was no longer as clean as initial projections had suggested. Attacks that should have succeeded began to fail at critical moments. Formations that were once stable began to experience minor but compounding disruptions. Not catastrophic. Not yet, but noticeable. "Report on fleet cohesion." Hale ordered. "Minor desynchronization detected in outer units." Came the response. "Communication latency is increasing under sustained coordination load." Hale's gaze sharpened. "Why?" "Unknown, but the anomaly's presence seems to correlate with increased signal interference across shared tactical channels." The implication was immediate. The more they coordinated, the more strain was introduced into their own systems. The human warship, still only partially visible through fluctuating sensor data, remained at the center of the engagement zone, not overwhelmed, not retreating, but actively engaging in a different kind of warfare, one that did not rely on destroying ships directly, but on understanding them, and then undermining the very systems that allowed them to fight as one. The Imperial fleet was no longer operating at peak cohesion, not visibly, not catastrophically, but beneath the surface of synchronized command structures, subtle fractures had begun to form. Reports arrived out of sequence. Target confirmations lagged by fractions of a second longer than before. Cross-linked systems that had once responded with near-perfect harmony now exhibited minor inconsistencies in timing. Individually, these delays were insignificant. Together, they were dangerous. Commander Hale stood rigid at the center of the command deck, eyes fixed on the evolving tactical grid. The human warship still occupied the engagement zone, its presence flickering unstable, but undeniably active. "Status of dreadnought formations?" he asked. "Fully deployed," came the response. "However, synchronization accuracy has decreased by approximately 2.3% across the fleet. Cause?" "No confirmed cause." A pause. Then another officer spoke, more cautiously. "There is a correlation between anomaly proximity and communication latency increases." Hale's gaze narrowed. "Explain." "Ships closer to the target are experiencing higher delays in command relay and confirmation loops. The effect scales with sustained exposure." Silence followed. It wasn't interference in the traditional sense. There were no jamming signals, no detectable electronic warfare emissions. And yet, their coordination was degrading. "Reroute communication channels through secondary relays." Hale ordered. "We've already implemented redundancy," the system's officer replied. "The issue persists even across independent pathways." Hale turned toward the display. The anomaly's distortion flickered again, slightly more stable than before, as if it had settled into a more consistent operational pattern. "Then it's not targeting our systems directly," he said. The analyst hesitated. "Sir, it's not disrupting signals." Hale's voice remained calm, but something beneath it had shifted. "It's affecting how we use them." A pause. Across the fleet, another coordinated strike was initiated. This time, the attack was designed to be overwhelming in both volume and timing. Multiple capital ships fired in layered sequences, each staggered to avoid predictable convergence points. At first, the pattern appeared effective. The human vessel reacted, but its response was different now, more efficient, more precise. On the tactical display, its movements aligned not just with incoming attacks, but with the gaps between them. It was exploiting the fleet's timing, not reacting to the weapons themselves, but to the intervals between decisions. Impact patterns are shifting, a weapons officer reported. The anomaly is avoiding high-density convergence zones while allowing lower-priority strikes to pass near its position. Why would it allow any hits at all? Another asked. The question lingered, because the answer was not obvious. Commander, the sensor officer said suddenly, urgency returning. We're detecting increased instability in fleet-wide command synchronization. Hale didn't look away from the display. Define instability. Command confirmations are no longer aligning uniformly across units. Some ships are executing delayed responses. Others are acting on outdated directives. And the anomaly? A pause. It appears to be exploiting those inconsistencies. On the tactical grid, the human warship shifted again. This time, its movement coincided with a moment of misalignment across multiple Imperial vessels. A coordinated volley launched slightly out of phase, just enough to disrupt the intended convergence. The result was not failure through destruction, but failure through timing. Hale's expression remained controlled, but the implications were now unavoidable. This isn't just evasion, he said quietly. No, sir, the analyst replied. It's interference. Another silence. The fleet had entered the engagement with overwhelming superiority in firepower, coordination, and numbers. Yet something within the battle had changed, not in the Empire's arsenal, but in its execution. And the anomaly, still present, still unstable, still partially hidden, was not merely surviving the assault. It was breaking it apart, piece by piece, from the inside out. The engagement did not end with a final explosion. It ended with something far more unsettling. Silence. Across the Imperial fleet, weapon systems powered down from sustained firing cycles. Targeting grids began to disengage. Tactical overlays flickered as command authority attempted to reassert full control over scattered units. But the cohesion that had defined Imperial dominance was gone, not destroyed, disrupted. Commander Hale stood at the command console, his gaze fixed on the central display. The human warship's distortion signature remained within the engagement zone, but now it appeared even less stable than before, flickering across multiple sensor layers without settling into a single resolvable form. Fleet status, Hale ordered. A pause followed, longer than expected. Commander, the systems officer began, then hesitated. Report. Multiple units are no longer responding to synchronized command channels. Some vessels have reverted to local autonomy protocols. Others are requesting manual confirmation for actions that should be automatic. Hale's eyes narrowed slightly. Why? No confirmed cause. Another officer stepped in. Command latency has increased beyond acceptable thresholds. Communication relays are experiencing intermittent desynchronization across the network. Is this localized? Hale asked. No, sir, came the reply. It's affecting the entire formation. A heavy silence settled over the bridge. Hale turned back toward the display. The anomaly remained, but now it was no longer the only variable in the equation. Damage assessment? He asked. Minimal structural losses, the weapons officer reported. No capital ships destroyed. Several escort vessels sustained minor system disruptions, but nothing catastrophic. Hale absorbed the information. No decisive defeat. No annihilation. And yet, the outcome was unmistakable. The Imperial fleet had failed to maintain operational superiority. Not because it lacked firepower, not because it lacked numbers, but because it had lost the ability to function as a unified system. Commander, the sensor officer said quietly, we're detecting a final anomaly signature shift. Hale looked up. Explain. The vessel, it's no longer maintaining a consistent positional presence. It's dispersing across multiple detection points before collapsing back into a non-resolvable state. Meaning, it's disengaging. On the display, the distortion flickered one last time, faint, fragmented, and increasingly difficult to track. Then, it vanished. No explosion, no warp signature, no trace of withdrawal, just absence. The engagement zone fell still. The Imperial fleet remained in formation, but the energy that had driven its coordinated assault had dissipated into fragmented operations and delayed responses. Hale exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in realization. "Transmit a full engagement report to High Command," he said. "Yes, Commander. And include this observation." He paused, choosing his words carefully. When he spoke again, his tone carried the weight of something newly understood. "We did not lose this engagement through force." A brief silence followed. "We lost it through structure." The words were recorded, logged, transmitted across the Empire's vast network. Analysts would review the data. Strategists would reconstruct the battle. Engineers would examine system performance. Admirals would debate tactics. But one conclusion would begin to emerge, quietly and with increasing clarity. The human warship had not needed to destroy the Imperial fleet. It had only needed to disrupt how the fleet thought and acted as one. And in doing so, it revealed a flaw the Empire had never accounted for. A system that depends entirely on predictability can be undone by an adversary that refuses to be predicted, far beyond the battlefield. In the silent expanse of uncharted space, the human warship drifted once more into obscurity, not defeated, not victorious in the traditional sense, but having proven something far more significant. In a galaxy built on control, it had shown that control could be broken, and the Empire had just experienced its first encounter with an enemy it could not fully see, let alone fully understand.